I think this is important for you guys to see. So some of the inputs that I just used, I used -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. Right? Well, when I compute x squared, I guess I get 4, 1, 0, 1, and 4. But when I go to compute 3x squared, what happens? Well, you're multiplying everything by 3. Am I multiplying the inputs by 3, or am I multiplying the outputs by 3? Like, what am I going to put here where there's a 2? What does 3x squared equal when x is 2? What does 3x squared equal if x is 2? Wouldn't it be 12? Right? Because you put a 2 in for the x, you compute x squared first, then you multiply by this a, and that's 12. What's this number going to be? If I put in a 1 for x, what's the output going to be? 3. And I can actually plot that. Here's 1, 3. I guess 2, 12 would be way up here somewhere. Let me pull that down so you can see it. It's there. Right. Okay. 0, 0, -1, 3, and -2, 12. So we do get a parabola, just like we did before. It's just what happened. A vertical scaling. It's almost like you're taking the y-axis and you're pulling it up. So it's 3 times stretched. And that stretches the parabola. Does that make sense to people? That's a vertical scaling. So if I come over here to the other side of the worksheet, let me find one like that. How about number 5, right? What happens to number 5? That's a vertical scaling by 2. We are stretching out the y-axis. So let's see. Here's an output of 0, 4, 0. What should the new graph be? Well, still 4, 0, because 2 times 0 is 0. Does that make sense to people? What about here? Here's 2, 2. Where should that move to? That should move up to 4 for the output. How about here? 0, 2 should move to 0, 4. Now this one's interesting, I think. What about here? When I put in a -4 and the output's -2, where should I put that now? I think it moves down. It was at -2, so now it's down to -4. Do you see that? Look what the picture looks like now. So it's not that it lifted everything. It did lift the stuff above the x-axis, but what did it do to stuff below the x-axis? It pushed it down. That's because what we're really doing is we're stretching out the y-axis by a factor of 2 here. Do you see that? You wouldn't see that here. You would only see a lift because everything's above the x-axis. So I think it's important to see that. What we really did was stretch the y-axis. That's called a scaling. Now, similarly, what do you think number 9 is going to do? There's the number b. You know what that does? It's a horizontal what? Scaling, right. It's a horizontal scaling. But here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. Inputs and outputs behave a little differently. It might not do what you think it's going to do. Here, let me explain more carefully. Let's look at 1 and 2 again. Do you remember the difference between 1 and 2? When it said +3, what happened? Went up 3. When we said +2 in the input, remember how it moved left? Something similar is happening here between number 5 and number 9. In number 5, we do a vertical scaling by 2. In number 9, we do a horizontal scaling. But do you know what happens? You divide. You divide each of the x-coordinates by 2. That might be confusing. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no, but number 1.
Oh, yeah.
That +3 is the output.
Yes.
And then in number 2, we have +.
So I do want to answer number 9. But the problem is that I think it's helpful to take a look at a parabola first. Okay? Now, I did y equals 3x squared, but I was looking, and on this parabola sheet, they don't give you any that have b involved. They give you this one that has a involved, but am I right? Okay, so I'm going to change problem 1 from this worksheet. Well, I'm still going to graph y equals x squared. So let's see, y equals x squared looks like this. We know that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do one in blue. So see if this makes sense to you. Again, the input is x, and I'm going to compute x squared. But now I want to compute something else. I want to graph this function in blue. Y equals, and I'm going to put parentheses, and I'm going to put 2x quantity squared. That's interesting. Well, it will be, I think. Okay, so what inputs are we going to use? Well, let's use what we've been using, -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. Okay, so my x squareds are 4, 1, 0, 1, and 4. And now what do I want to compute here? I want to compute 2x quantity squared, because I want to learn how that works. Well, that's kind of weird. Let's see. I know when I put in, for example, a 2 for x, you know what the output ends up being? Why 16? Yeah, 2 times 2 is 4, squared is 16. Well, that's kind of weird. At 2, my output is 4, 8, 12, 16. Way off the map. Maybe it's up there. What about if I input 1? What do I end up having for an output? 4. That's right here. That's weird. What if I input 0? Then the output is 0, and then these are also 4 and 16. So some people might say, hey, that blue graph, what kind of scaling did I say that is? Well, doesn't it look like the vertical one? What's the difference, right? Here's the vertical, and this one I said is horizontal. Isn't that weird? But let me show you what happened. So, if we understand that, it really does do similar things to a parabola, but it is fundamentally different. Now I want to show you something. How much, if instead of thinking of this as a horizontal shift, you thought of it as a vertical shift, do you see how much we're moving vertically? Well, we're moving from 1 to 4, or from 4 to 16. How much are we actually moving vertically? Isn't it like stretching it 4 times as much, right? So a horizontal shift by 2, but watch what happens. I can simplify. What does y equals 2x squared parentheses simplify to? Now all of a sudden that's thinking of it as a vertical shift. So horizontal shift is when we're inside the parentheses, vertical shift is outside the parentheses. Does that make any sense? Now, if I have something like what I have in number 7, I can't simplify like that as easily. Because x minus 1 squared, that's not so nice anymore. Okay? This one, you're going to have to do things in multiple steps. So I'd like to demonstrate just a couple of those, and then I think I'll be okay. So for number 7, let's see. What is going on? Let's list what's happening. Well, first of all, I'll graph y equals x squared. Y equals x squared looks like this. Right? It's that parabola. And now in green, I want to list what happens. So what letters are involved? Well, this 2, what letter is that? A is 2. And that corresponds to what? That's vertical because it's outside the parentheses. Vertical what? Scaling. And what about this 1 here, or this minus 1? What does that correspond to? H, which is a horizontal shift. So I have to shift this parabola which way? Let's see, horizontal. So we're going to go to the right one, right? It's always x minus h, if you want, is a way to think of it. So we'll move to the right one. And then the only difference is we're scaling everything by 2. See, if I just moved it to the right one, I like to do these in steps. It would look like this, right? If I just moved it to the right one, it would look like that. But what I'm actually doing is moving to the right one and also doing what? Scaling everything, so multiplying by 2. So these things are going to be higher than they would have been. So it'd be up here and up here. And so I really do get something like this. And I could check that on a graphing calculator. Of course, when I get to the problems on the worksheet over here, I don't have an equation anymore. I can't graph it on the calculator as easily. All right. Of course, these are not multiple step either. These are a little easier. Are there any you'd like me to do? I could do a couple more of these, and then I'm going to wrap it up. Yeah, we can do that next. But I'm talking about this before I put this away. 7? Okay. What letter is that there? That 1/2 is what letter? And a equals 1/2 corresponds to what kind of transformation? Vertical. Is it a shift or a scaling? That's a scaling, right? We're going to scale by 1/2. We're going to multiply everything by 1/2 in terms of output. And so I'm seeing this. I'm seeing, well, instead of an output of 2, I'm going to have an output of 1. Instead of an output of 2, I'm going to have an output of 1. 0 times 1/2 is 0. And then here, instead of -2, what's my output going to be? -1, right? Half of each of those. And so I'm picturing something like that. Does this make sense? Okay. Time to move on to homework.